a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Why would anyone drink bad coffee? It does nothing for your inner workings and it makes you show bad faces. Drink good coffee and look happy. Drink the best coffee and be happy. The best coffee in the universe can be yours by swinging by 4501 McPherson, the Organic Man Coffee Trike. Julio roasts the beans fresh, and that's the best you can get. If driving is just too far, jump on the old computer and go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Your body and those around you will look and act far better. David Subith sent me a video about a weird case from back in 1990. I looked into it and I thought, this needs more study. Strange things in the sky. In 1990, an Air Mexico flight was returning from the Bahamas. Here is something for the school teachers out there. They went to the Bahamas in their pajamas. If you don't get it, ask a school teacher. If they can't tell you, ask a school teacher from many years ago, like maybe 20 or so. You can also ask about the big underwear. Getting way off the subject here. 1990, a plane coming back from the Bahamas. The passengers had all stayed on the island and the flight crew were heading back to Mexico City. This was back before overbooking became all the craze, when on occasion you might have an empty airplane flying home. It had been a long flight that day, and most of the cabin crew took the opportunity to grab some sleep. The plane was midpoint between the Bahamas and Mexico City, still out over the Gulf of Mexico. The cockpit crew were half awake. Literally, that is. The pilot was keeping an eye on the instruments while the co-pilot snoozed. The flight engineer was checking his gauges before he decided to find some nice dark corner back in the cabin to catch a few winks as well. This is the not so glamorous part of working for an airline. Come to think of it, a lot of the work on an airline is missing the glamour part. It was replaced by long hours and a bunch of nasty passengers. Try to imagine, it's kind of like having a bunch of people around who you can't get away from, and they're all acting like Karen. As the stewardess entered the cockpit is a weird thing for something that is so technical. In 1580, the term cockpit meant a pit where they used fighting roosters. In Old English naval jargon, a cock was a small boat, and swain meant servant, better known as a coxswain. The compartment where the coxswain was seated began to be called a cockpit. As airlines came into being, the control area looked a lot like the old cockpit on a boat, so the name became used in aviation. Most pilots call it the flight deck these days. I'm not a pilot, so it's a cockpit for me. A stewardess named Bertha Tilo was checking to see if anybody in the cockpit needed any life-giving fluids, better known as coffee. Airplane coffee is horrible, but it does contain caffeine, so you take what you can get. It was around 3 a.m. and the sky was totally dark. Bertha went to the cockpit to ask the pilot if he needed coffee. Entering the cabin, she noticed the entire interior was lit by some kind of a weird light coming in through the windshield. It was bright white and it filled the control area. The pilot and co pilot were both looking out, trying to see where the light was coming from. The flight engineer was busy with his gauges. He was getting all kinds of weird readings, none of which made any sense. Bertha stood there wondering if this was something to be worried about, or just some anomaly. The pilot looked very concerned, but not too worried. Lots of questions were being asked, but the answers were not forthcoming. Finally, once it was apparent that the light was just a light, she asked if anybody needed coffee, to which the flight crew all said yes. Bertha went back to the first class kitchen, but the coffee maker was already shut off and cleaned. She went back to the second kitchen to check there. As she was passing the seats between the wings, she noticed movement outside the plane. It was a moonless night, but there was definitely something out there. Bertha moved over to the window and had a better look. There was some kind of creature walking along the wing as if the plane wasn't traveling somewhere around 600 miles an hour. It was very pale and skinny. It walked along the wing, moving closer to the far tip, moving away from the window. This was way too weird, so Bertha ran back to the cockpit and she told the pilot. The pilot thought she was seeing things, but he asked the flight engineer to head back and see what was out there. The flight engineer accompanied Bertha back to the center of the plane. He probably rolled his eyes as she told him to have a look, but he did. And there was something walking along the wing. The commotion of first Bertha and then her and the flight engineer running back and forth, along with a lot of hushed words, brought the rest of the cabin crew out of their dreams and into a waking nightmare. The flight engineer was the second person to run back to the cockpit and tell the pilot there was a thing on the wing. He didn't have any trouble convincing the pilot what he'd just seen. There were two pale-looking creatures with huge eyes looking in through the front windshield. The co-pilot said he could see a third creature outside his window. The best description of these things would be grays or even the pale crawlers. To add to everyone's distress, the flight controls were no longer responding. All the instruments were going haywire. Static was coming over the radio, and the bright light was back in the sky. The bizarre activity went on for about an hour and a half. During times of extreme distress, time is very hard to judge. The creatures outside never tried to get in. It was more like they were curious about the humans on the inside. The folks inside couldn't figure out what to do other than watch and wait. At long last, the creatures jumped from the plane and vanished into the night. The bright light was whisked away as well. As the night once more became nothing but darkness, the plane controls returned to normal. The gauges were all right where they belonged. The water gave way to land as Mexico came into view. It was still dark out, but the crew all gave a sigh of relief, knowing they were getting close to home. A decision needed to be made. Do they report what just happened and run the risk of public ridicule along with possible, no, probably, losing their jobs, or keep the entire thing to themselves and deal with the nightmares and the self-doubt on their own? It didn't take much for everybody involved to say the folks back in Mexico City should never hear a word about what happened. They all swore to keep the whole thing to themselves. As the crew was getting their things together to head out into their not so brave new world, folks began to take note of the fact all the watches and clocks were now several minutes behind the time at the airport. Only a few minutes, but it was enough to be worrisome. With time, a few of the flight crew managed to convince themselves nothing had actually happened. The human mind is quite bizarre when it comes to the inner workings. Some of the crew decided the whole thing was just some weird little incident, but there had been no creatures on the wings whatsoever and no bright white light outside. Others kept their secret, only revealing it to those close enough to never spill the beans. The term spill the beans might date back to ancient Greece. When casting an anonymous vote, colored beans were used. If you spilled the beans too soon, everybody knew who had voted and for what. You could also say, let the cat out of the bag. Like many secrets, word leaked out. Nobody knows why or when, but Bertha did eventually agree to an interview with a news reporter. Maybe she told somebody and they had passed on the story, but word did get out, and eventually a reporter was asking her about this situation. This might be the reason that her name is the only one connected to the story. She met with a reporter and went over the entire story. He took notes on what she said and then he put them away and never used them. It was years before the story actually leaked out to the general public. The story was more of a legend. People knew about creatures clambering over the outside of a passenger plane, but nobody knew if it was real or if it was just a story, and nobody could say for sure when or where it happened. The news reporter heard people talking about this incident, and he searched his office until he found his notes. To this day, the story is still unbelievable, but most good stories are. Way back when I was young, we used to watch The Twilight Zone every week. The episode, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, was the third show of the fifth season. For those of you that are familiar with his voice, think of Rod Serling and hear his words as I speak them. I'm not even going to try to mimic him. If you never watched any of his shows, too bad. So sad. Your life will never be complete until you find and watch all of Rod Serling's TV shows. And there are a bunch of them. Rod Serling said at the beginning of the show, Portrait of a Frightened Man. Mr. Robert Wilson, 37, husband, father, salesman, on sick leave. Mr. Wilson has just been discharged from a sanitarium where he spent the last 6 months recovering from a nervous breakdown, the onset of which took place on an evening not dissimilar to this one, on an airliner very much like the one in which Mr. Wilson is about to be flown home. The difference being that on that evening, half a year ago, Mr. Wilson's flight was terminated by the onset of his mental breakdown. Tonight, he's traveling all the way to his appointed destination, which, contrary to Mr. Wilson's plans, happened to be in the darkest corner of the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling could speak. He was also extremely nervous. The original plan for the Twilight Zone was they were going to get Orson Welles to be the host. But Mr. Wells could not get out of his contract to another studio. And so at the last minute, like, it's showtime, folks. And Rod Serling didn't have a host. He was so nervous that he practically couldn't speak. You never saw him without a cigarette in his hand. It was kind of his comfort blanket, if you will. That's kind of why he is no longer with us, but that and the fact that he did get kind of old. But yeah, Rod Serling was terrified of speaking in front of the camera. You couldn't tell by listening. Back to the show. While traveling by airplane, Robert Wilson, played by William Shatner, sees a gremlin on the wing. He tries to alert his wife, Julia, played by Christine White, and the stewardess, who is played by Asa Maynard. Every time somebody else looks out the window, the gremlin hides itself, so Robert's claims seem crazy. Robert admits the oddness of the gremlin, avoiding everyone else's sight, but not his. His credibility is further undermined by this being his first flight since suffering a nervous breakdown 6 months earlier, which also occurred on an aircraft. Robert realizes that his wife is starting to think he needs to go back into the sanitarium. But his more immediate concern is the gremlin is tinkering with the wiring under one of the engine cowlings, which can cause the aircraft to crash. He managed to steal a sleeping police officer's revolver and he shoots the gremlin. Once the airplane is landed, everybody believes that Robert has gone completely insane. In a straitjacket, he is whisked away on a gurney. Robert tells his wife that he is alone in his knowledge of what really happened during the flight. The final scene reveals conspicuous damage to the exterior of one of the aircraft's engines, which would confirm to people that Robert was right all along. Oh, the gremlin was played by Nick Kravitz. And I just have to say this now. You want to see something really scary? For those of you that never saw the movie The Twilight Zone, the movie, go watch it. I've seen this episode with Captain Kirk in the lead role several times, probably a dozen. During some holidays, the networks will run a marathon, and I will just simply have to watch it. The episode The Invaders is another one of my favorites. Agnes Moorehead portrays the part of a woman living alone in a cabin out in the woods. She is attacked by an alien creatures. She's the only actor in the episode, and through the entire show, she never says a word. Of course, To Serve Man is also a good one. The name gremlin comes from the Old English word gremian, which means to vex. Gremlins are highly mechanical creatures that live around tools and inside machines and appliances. They have been responsible for much technological progress, but are also known for their destructive tendencies. I've had a gremlin under my hood twice now. Both times I was either going to or coming from a UFO conference. Depictions of these creatures are very widely, but Depictions of these creatures vary widely, but they're often depicted as small, impish creatures with pointy ears and sharp teeth. The folks who hear about these things consider them to be like elves or fairies, but to pilots, they can be the worst thing in the skies. Some will tell us gremlins are just made up creatures that come about in the 20th century. As man began to take to the skies, pilots began seeing things that became known as gremlins. The damage they did was real, but the creatures simply had to be imaginary. Depictions of these creatures vary, widely. The stories about them and references to them as the causes of especially inexplicable technological and mental problems of pilots became popular during the Second World War. These are mischievous creatures that sabotage aircraft. One of the first stories arose in the Royal Air Force slang among British pilots stationed in Malta, the Middle East, and India in the 1920s. The earliest printed record in a poem published in the journal Aeroplane in Malta, April 10th, 1929. Tales of gremlin-like creatures abounded long before the aviation era. European folks European folklore is filled with stories of such mischievous imps and elves, fairies and goblins, all of whom interfered with human life, sometimes playfully and sometimes maliciously. Before the Industrial Revolution, these creatures worked with tools available to the rest of humans. They might work on shoes or cut wood in the forest. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, gremlins began to acquire and hone skills as craftsmen, benevolently helping Robert Fulton, who perfected his steamboat. They may have also helped Benjamin Franklin during his kite flying exercise. With the dawn of the air age in the early 20th century, gremlins metamorphosed into something more sinister. When World War I broke out, inexplicable events began to occur in and around these new flying machines. A sure sign that this is particular strain of medieval gnome had quite literally spread its wings and flown into the latest technology. My cats keep doing crazy things around me, and I'm trying not to be drawn into their insanity. The origin of the modern term gremlin is disputed, but is often said to derive from an Old English word greme or gremlin. I mentioned that earlier, but I mentioned it twice. It means to vex or annoy. It refers to, that's what my cats are. They're gremlins. They're always vexing and annoying me. It refers to a type of mischievous gnome-like imp or demon. Yeah, that's a cat. Typically said to be about a foot to 3 feet tall, which has its roots in the old folklore of goblins and fairies. The early representations of these creatures was that of a skilled craftsman with a superhuman proficiency with machinery of all types, and they were once credited with helping mankind along with our technology. For all the benevolent early folklore associated with these creatures, it was their penchant for mischief and mayhem that they became well known once the war broke out. The modern version of the gremlin as a mischievous, troublemaking hellraiser has its origin with British airmen, some of whom believed that there were miniature imps, gnomes, or fairies which seemed to show an interest in aviation and caused aircraft or navigational equipment to malfunction. One of the first mentions of the creatures can be traced back to an early reference to them in the early 1900s in a British newspaper called The Spectator. The article said, the old Royal Navy Air Service in 1917 and the newly constituted Royal Air Force in 1918 appear to have detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious sprites whose sole purpose in life was to bring about as many as possible of the inexplicable mishaps which, in those days as now, troubled an airman's life. The existence of such weird entities became much wider in 1923 when a British pilot crashed his plane into the sea and later reported that the accident had been caused by tiny creatures which had followed him aboard his plane and proceeded to create havoc aboard, sabotaging the engines and messing around with the flight controls, ultimately causing it to crash. The story spread, and it wasn't long before other British pilots also began to complain of being harassed by similar miniature troll like creatures with a mastery of technology and machinery, which caused engine failures, electrical malfunctions, communication shutdowns, bad landings, freak accidents, and pretty much anything else that could possibly ever go wrong with an airplane. Gremlins were said to engage in such bad behavior as sucking the gas out of gas tanks, jamming radio frequency, mucking up landing gear, blowing dust or sand into fuel pipes or sensitive electronic equipment, cutting wires, removing bolts or screws, tinkering with dials, knobs, switches, jostling the controls, slashing the wings open and the tires, poking or pinching gunners and pilots, banging insistently on the fuselage, breaking windows, and a wide variety of other prankish acts. There were even pilots who said the creatures had telepathic powers and could create realistic illusions in a victim's mind, such as the appearance of the ground or a mountain emerging suddenly from a cloud. They were also sometimes reported to be seen sitting on the nose of a plane or the wings or the aircraft in mid flight, tampering with the wings or even the engines. On occasion, the gremlins were said to shout, giggle, whisper, growl, or otherwise make noises so as to distract the air crews, in particular gunners, as they were lining up their sights on an enemy, and pilots when performing maneuvers for which total concentration was a necessity. Such reports spread quickly through the ranks, and by the end of the 1920s, it seemed like any pilot who had ever had an aircraft problem of any kind had seen these things, and they were commonly reported throughout the Royal Air Force by pilots stationed in every air base that they had. Airfield, not base. American aviator and military officer Charles Lindbergh had his own problems with gremlins as he flew across the Atlantic in 1927. Lindbergh had been flying his single engine, single seat plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, from Roosevelt Field in Garden City, New York, to Le Bourget Field in Paris, France. 3,600 miles. It was going to take him 33 and a half hours. Uh, in his ninth hour of being airborne, Lindbergh reported he had suddenly felt somewhat detached from reality, and he found himself suddenly surrounded by vaporous, strange-looking beings within the cramped confines of his tiny cabin. These beings spoke to him and demonstrated incredibly complex knowledge of navigation and flight equipment. Rather than causing mischief, Lindbergh said the gremlins kept him alert and they reassured him that he would remain safe on his journey. Lindbergh kept his bizarre experiences to himself for years until the account was finally published in his 1953 book, The Spirit of St. Louis. This was not the only report of benevolent gremlin activity, as there were other accounts from time to time that told of typically mischievous monsters helping pilots avert disasters or alerting them when to turn or change course or altitude, which showed there was more than one facet to whatever these things were. Or maybe there's more than one kind of gremlin, kind of like a lot of other creatures. It all depends on the creature itself. Like people, some are good and others need to be locked up forever. There was an early reference to gremlins in a book by aviator Pauline Gowers from a 1938 novel. It was called the ATA, Women with Wings. Scotland is described as Gremlin country, a mystical and rugged territory where scissor-welding gremlins cut the wires of biplanes when unsuspecting pilots were flying over the countryside. There's a rather bizarre incident pertaining to an American aircraft from 1939, before the United States was drawn into the war, which may or may not be related to gremlins. A transport plane left the Marine Air Base in San Diego, California, at around 3:30 in the afternoon. It was a late summer evening. They were en route to Honolulu with a crew of 13. Somewhere around 3 hours into the flight, the aircraft made a distress call, after which communications went dead. Despite its radio being completely silent, the plane managed to arrive back at its base. The way it limped in from a bumpy emergency landing and the heavy damage on the outside of the plane, it was a miracle the plane was still in the air. The exterior looked as if it had been hit by some kind of an exploding weapon. As soon as the damaged plane had skidded to a halt, the ground crews moved in to investigate. Inspection of the craft's interior uncovered the bodies of 12 of the plane's crew, all of them displaying gruesome, gaping wounds of unknown origins. Further adding to the strangeness was the fact that the whole cabin reeked of sulfuric smell, and there were empty bullet shells strewn about the floor of the cockpit and the crew's cabin. The pilot and the co-pilot both were holding empty firearms. The only survivor was the co-pilot, who had managed to land the plane despite being severely wounded himself. He died later at the hospital before having any chance to give an account of what had happened aboard the doomed flight. The actual physical description of gremlins varies widely. In some cases, they're described as being little elfish beings similar to humans wearing bright red or green uh, outfits, old fashioned hats with feathers stuck in them, and pointy shoes. Sound like an elf. The skin color could be green, gold, pink, or red. Others gave the entities a more sinister appearance, saying that they looked animalistic, with hairy bodies, large pointy ears, deep red or even glowing eyes, and sometimes horns. Other reports told of gremlins having hairless gray skin, being very vaguely reptilian in appearance, and having enormous mouths filled with pointy teeth. If you never saw the movie, go watch it. That's what these things are supposed to look like. There were cases where they looked like jackrabbits or bull terriers, and sometimes a combination of both. In some sightings, they were merely wispy entities, seemingly composed of mist or smoke. They were seen with webbed hands and feet, fins, or bat-like wings. Size varied considerably, with gremlins said to be anywhere from 6 inches all the way up to 3 feet. In some cases, they were said to have large feet with suction cups on the bottoms, or leather shoes with hooks built in, both of which enabled them to walk along the outside of the aircraft, or even hang upside down. One common trait in all the reports is whatever means, gremlins were known to be able to adhere to the outer fuselage or the wings of the plane and to withstand incredible temperature extremes, high altitudes, and violent winds. Gremlins and their bothersome antics were reported throughout the 1920s and 30s, but perhaps the period of the most intense gremlin activity was during the fighting of World War II. Reports of gremlins were especially prolific among the UK's RAF units, especially the High Altitude Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, which flew perilous missions way the heck up where nobody should have been. They had unarmed Spitfires and Mosquitoes, British planes, and they had no way of defending themselves. Plus, there was no heat in the pilot's compartment. All the heat was being redirected into the camera cabin so that the cameras could work properly. So the pilot was freezing to death while trying to fly at night. Yikes. It was during these missions that pilots operating in bitter cold airplanes began to see gremlins on the outside of their planes doing nasty things to their planes. In some cases, mechanical problems would arise that would mysteriously become okay once the plane was back on the ground, as if the gremlins were interfering with their mission. April 1942, an article in the Royal Air Force Journal written by Herbert Griffith, a former pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, titled The Gremlin Question. Griffith related how he had recently been attached to the RAF wing in northern Russia. He had never heard of gremlins until his flying mates told him about these creatures. They told him they operated in droves and swarms. One imagined them as a procession of rats led by the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Griffith wrote there were Mediterranean gremlins as well as East Fifeshire gremlins, and that pilots throughout the RAF seemed to be on nodding terms with them. He was assured that the gremlins were not always malevolent. They could be playful and have a sense of humor. Who could actually draw the outline of a gremlin? Griffith asked rhetorically. Is he a presence rather than a personality, a spirit rather than an embodiment? The article by Herbert Griffith in the Servicemen's Royal Air Force Journal, dated April 18, 1942, chronicles the appearance of gremlins. The article states the stories had been in existence for several years, with later recollections of it having been told by British Spitfire pilots during the 1940s. The Battle of Britain, an enormous air campaign waged against the United Kingdom by the German Air Force during the summer and autumn of 1940, in particular, saw many cases of gremlin activity. So much so that the British Air Ministry acknowledged the problem and made serious attempts to investigate this phenomenon. The ministry went as far as having a service manual written up by the gremlinorist pilot officer Percy Prune, which was an official document consisting of a list of creatures, exploits, how to placate or distract gremlins, and various ways to avoid accidents due to their presence, such as not displaying bravado, arrogance, or overconfidence, which was thought to attract these creatures. There were posters hung up at airfields that warned of these malicious little monsters. I don't like coincidences, but the other day I was listening to Expanded Perspectives, and they were talking about gremlins as well. I had written up my show notes 3 days ago, and I listened to the show yesterday. That's a coinkydink. I let Kyle Filson know about this, and he agreed it's a bit weird how that works out. In a surprising twist of war, gremlins are credited with keeping the RAF morale up, and it kept the pilots in the air. The planes being used to keep the Nazis out of Britain were sometimes not the best. Cheap and rapid manufacturing caused a lot of issues. Some fighter planes were less than serviceable. Instead of placing the blame on the folks making these planes or the politicians who allowed these companies to get away with these problems, the pilots blamed gremlins as the cause of all of their breakdowns and crashes. Once the culprit had been identified, the pilots set out to outsmart or outmaneuver these devilish creatures. War profiteering went on, and the RAF managed to keep Hitler off of the island. Gremlins were the bane of military pilots, but they began to appear in the United States after Walt Disney wrote an article about after hearing stories told by RAF pilots. 1942, Disney wrote, "Ever seen a gremlin? No? Well, maybe it's because you haven't been up in a British Spitfire swapping bullets with a Messerschmitt, or dodging a German flak in a bombing raid over Hamburg." The article had a few drawings that were sketched by Disney to add to the story. The following year, Roald Dahl, an RAF fighter ace and writer, added the Gremlin stories in the U.S. While serving as an assistant air attaché at the British Embassy in Washington, Dahl published his first children's novel, The Gremlins, a fable of tiny creatures who flew on missions with Spitfire and Hurricane pilots. The book was a hit, so much so that Disney approached Dahl about turning it into a feature film. With Dahl's assistance, Disney Studios developed a series of gremlin characters and began production on the film. During that time, Dahl recounted his own experiences with the creatures in a story that appeared in a U.S. newspaper, featuring a lot of drawings done by Disney. The film project stalled, partially because Dahl insisted that gremlins were exclusively an RAF icon and that they were their creations. He insisted on final script and production approval, which prevented Disney from establishing formal rights to the Gremlins story. Disney also felt the involvement of the British Air Ministry, which had given Dahl permission to work in Hollywood and had a hand in the film's contract, would prove unduly restrictive. Walt Disney abandoned the motion picture project, but he pursued his newfound fascination with gremlins in other ways. In issues 33 through 41 of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, published from June 43 to February of 44, they featured 9 episodes of stories with a character named Gremlin Gus, marking the first appearance of the creature in comic books. Gremlins made other appearances in other pop culture arenas during the World War. In addition to different versions of Dahl's children's book, Warner Brothers Studios produced a number of colorful cartoon stories featuring gremlins. The gremlins vexed flight crews. Extra maps placed in a kit bag somehow would vanish in flight, particularly on occasions when a faulty compass forced the aircrew off of their planned course. They would discover a wrench sitting next to a magnetic compass, which would cause your compass to do crazy things. A perfectly good sextant would suddenly lose its bubble, so you couldn't level the thing. When wireless radios were first installed in aircraft, there was no end to the ways in which gremlins could distort reception and fill frequencies with static. February 1944, at what appears to have been the high watermark of gremlin activity, an article in the Journal of Educational Sociology asked, "What are some of the circumstances that have led to so large a body of men to believe so vividly in the existence of vicious little creatures that they are consciously aware of their actual presence under certain conditions. The author of this article, Charles Messenger, went on to conclude that there was no doubt that the gremlin phenomena can be considered pathological in its origin. It is so easy to sit behind a desk and hand out derision. I wonder if Messenger would have been brave enough to climb aboard a bomber before writing his articles explaining away these sightings. Gremlins were originally thought to be sympathetic towards the enemy. They all were in league with Adolf Hitler. But this was later deemed false as enemy aircraft was suffering from the same issues. Gremlins were portrayed as tricksters and opportunity acting on their own self interests. They might disable one plane while letting others go by without a second glance. They attacked both sides with the same amount of vigor, and both sides thought these creatures belonged to the enemy. There were many types of gremlins. Water gremlins were a genus that pilots would like to eradicate. They specialized in disabling carburetors by spurting water into the fuel lines. Bomby gremlins would make a bomb turn handsprings and land far from its target. Gremlin cousins, called gablins, specialized in making unthinking soldiers repeat vital military information to persons unauthorized, maybe the enemy, to know such things. Gremlins soon spread to the U.S. Army Air Corps, whose pilots began to complain about a host of issues, including reliable engines suddenly failing, nuts coming loose. While most American airmen looked upon these as negative, others viewed them in a different light. The Women's Air Service pilots, the WASPs, adopted the gremlin Fifinella as their official mascot. August 1942, a report in the Camden, New Jersey Courier Post suggested that these creatures were now at work on the U.S. Army Air Corps. What may have been the first appearance of a gremlin in an American aircraft was reported by Sergeant Z.E. White, a waist gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress named the Big Punk, who said his gun had jammed just as he was sighting on a German fighter plane during a battle over the North Sea. After landing, White related this story to pilot Oscar Cohen. Cohen nodded and said, "Gremlins." American journalists in England attached to the newly arrived U.S. 8th Air Force, most notably Peter Edson and Gladwin Hill, members of the Writing 69th, filed a number of newspaper stories about gremlins, introducing them to the American public some more. Also known as the flying typewriters, is that anything like the flying toasters? Some of you will know what I'm talking about there. The flying typewriters. The journalists trained to fly and accompanied bomber missions over Germany. According to Hill, gremlins were bat-eared, long-nosed, garishly costumed creatures who lived in nooks, but they were allergic to crannies. He was trying to be funny there. They had a large colony, was known to exist between Whitechurch and Newbury, and probably living in a rubbish dump. It's weird during war times how newspaper writers will come up with these weird stories trying to make the war just not quite so scary or bad. Quentin Reynolds, the celebrated American war correspondent, also took note. In an article for October 1942 issue of Collier's magazine titled What Every Pilot Knows, Reynolds revealed the real reason for Gremlin's fiendish warfare. He said, "The RAF lads made one mistake. They laughed at the Gremlins, and the fact is these little people, above everything else, do not like being laughed at." He recounted one day hearing a mysterious, soft voice, which may have well belonged to a gremlin, advising him that there was only one solution. "You'll have to get the RAF to stop laughing." Before they became famous B-29 crewmen, the three key airmen on the Enola Gay, Paul Tibbets, Tom Freeby, and Dutch Van Kirk, were serving aboard a B-17 bomber, a flying fortress in Europe. In 1942, Tibbets' crew was in the process of coming up with a name for their bomber. Radio operator Sergeant Orville Spitt came across an RAF poem that enumerated the various different colored gremlins. Because the poem made no mention of red gremlins, Spitt figured that they must be among the few good gremlins. The crew concurred, and thus one of the World War II's most famous B-17s got its name, the Red Gremlin. One American B-17 pilot during World War II, known only as LW, had a rather bizarre, harrowing experience with gremlins while engaged in a combat mission. The man reported he was taking an enormous plane higher, and he could hear a strange sound coming from the engine and the instruments of the plane in front of him. It started going haywire. When the pilot looked outside to his left, he saw a freakish entity outside the window latched on to the plane that was described as being 3 feet tall, with abnormally long arms, gray, hairless skin, deep red eyes, a gaping mouth full of teeth, and it had pointy ears with tufts of hair at the ends. This thing was staring in at him from the wing and out there in the bitter cold beyond the glass. When the pilot looked to the nose of the aircraft, he was astonished to see there was another one of these creatures, apparently dancing about out there and pounding away haphazardly at the nose of his plane. The pilot thought at first he was perhaps hallucinating or experiencing some kind of disorientation, but he reported he felt sharp and in complete control of his senses. The pilot said the strange creatures appeared to be laughing maniacally, and that they gleefully cavorted about outside his plane, pulling on whatever they could get their clawed hands on, banging on the aircraft with all their might, and obviously trying their best to bring the plane down. After a bit of maneuvering, the pilot managed to shake the critters off his plane, although he would later say he had no idea if they had fallen to their deaths or they had merely jumped to another plane. LW was apprehensive about telling anybody about this frightening ordeal, but when he told a gunner friend of his about this incident, the gunner said he'd had a similar experience on a training mission just a few days before. August 3rd, 1944, Royal Air Force Captain Geoff Wilkner set out to deliver an Avro Lancaster from Strathaven, England, to the RAF Scrampton Air Base in Lincolnshire. Wilkner wanted to take advantage of the clear skies and good visibility, so he took his flight engineer and had him practicing on feathering routine. The engines had to be positioned. The engineer had to position 2 fingers under the feathering button and yank it out at just the right moment, preventing the bomber's engines from overrunning their maximum revolutions. They feather the props so that they stop spinning as the air passes over them. Otherwise, the wind will cause the prop to start to spin faster and faster, which will eventually lead to the engine catching on fire. This is a disabled engine I'm talking about. The exercise went smoothly until the plane suddenly veered to port. The engines had cut out. Thinking fast, Wickner immediately maneuvered the Lancaster towards nearby Shellingthorpe Airfield. He came in very high and very fast, but he wrestled the Lancaster down safely, doing what is known as a dead stick landing. That's when you don't have any engines. You're just gliding in a plane that's not designed to glide. Once the plane was almost on the ground, all the engines mysteriously fired back up. I thought I turned that off. Suddenly, the engines all fired back up, and the plane seemed to be good as new. Wickner was left to wonder what had caused this anomaly. Was it mechanical error, or was it the handiwork of those devilish creatures, the gremlins, that he'd been hearing about, but he'd never encountered before? Mark Sheldon, one of Australia's top fighter pilots, was among those who believed that the gremlins weren't just optical illusions or fragments of the imagination. The whole thing is they more or less reflect your mood, he once explained. If you fly carefully and well and they will treat you good. If you fly badly, they act badly by you. By the end of the war, the Gremlins had become firmly entrenched in Western flying lore. In the years to come, their mystique would spread well beyond the military. Gremlins have also figured in many print, motion picture, and television scripts. In 1947, Dahl published Sometime Never, a fable for supermen, a serious adult novel about a race of nature-loving gremlins that are trying to escape the human world of continuous warfare. Of course, the before mentioned 1963 television episode of The Twilight Zone, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, starring William Shatner, and featuring an evil gremlin attempting to rip an engine from the wing of an airplane. 1980s and 90s saw a spat of gremlin-oriented films, including Steven Spielberg's 1984 hit, The Gremlins. In 2006, a new generation was introduced to the gremlin mythos when Dark Horse Comics published The Gremlins, the lost Walt Disney production, a restored and updated print version of the never-realized World War II film, featuring an introduction by the film historian Leonard Maltin. Dark Horse subsequently published a comic book miniseries starring gremlin characters. A special edition of Dahl's original book was produced in 2007 to mark the 60th anniversary of the U.S. Air Force. Distributed exclusively through the Army and Air Force Exchange Services, it included a brief history of the book, and its dust jacket featured the Air Force commemorative anniversary seal. The initial print ran out at all participating exchange service locations on the first day. Ernest K. Gann, a former aviator and author, also looked into gremlins. Gann suggested the possibility of an unseen, often capricious, self-appointed creature that was there to balance the yin and yang of human life. One man's good fortune is offset by another person or his own's grim fate. Why was one man spared, Gann wondered, when his DC-4 tail did not break off, while on the same day another pilot in an identical airplane with the identical structural fault suffered a fiery death. In his classic book, Fate is the Hunter, Gain labeled it as such, fate, for indeed, as he pondered what else could it be. He was not fully satisfied with that conclusion, though he was never able to come up with a better one. Atmospheric beasts are the strangest of flying monsters from ufology, cryptozoology, and astrobiology. According to eyewitness reports, these beings are apparently living creatures, but they break all the usual rules that biology apply to living organisms. They appear to be able to levitate without any need for wings, as well as their bodies are depicted in a semi-solid, often partially invisible state. These beasts are thought to be very fragile and lightweight creatures who are either native to Earth or aliens that came from elsewhere. Atmospheric beasts are sometimes thought to have originated in the atmosphere of some other planet or maybe even some gas cloud traveling through space. These things qualify as being alien, even if they did evolve over the clouds. If they never walked the Earth, they're extraterrestrials. Some say these things are not intelligent, but exist more like floating jellyfish, going wherever the wind takes them and consuming other atmospheric things. There have been a few videos showing huge translucent blobs moving through the sky. Most look like jellyfish. There's also a theory that these things are alien spacecraft, probably unmanned, if manned is the right term, kind of like a cellular drone. In a few eyewitness accounts, atmospheric beasts can change their density, becoming smaller, harder masses that are usually metallic in color, or they can become larger and cloud-like, even to the point of invisibility. They may even glow for their own reasons. Some sightings say they resemble whales, and because of this, they are now called sky whales or cloud beasts. Could gremlins be considered atmospheric beasts? Some, perhaps. The ones that seem to be more ethereal than solid. The folks researching atmospheric beasts say these beings live way above the earth, floating around like creatures in the sea. The gremlins of old spent their days living and working with both feet on the ground. It wasn't until airplanes came into being that the gremlins took to the air. Or could we say that it wasn't until man took to the air that they started to see gremlins? Once more, I find a vast mix of cryptids being squeezed into one box. If it's seen around an airplane, it must be a gremlin. Take that same creature and place it under a bridge. Well, now you have a goblin. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell other people they should be listening as well. If you want to support the show, buy one of my books. Paranormal Research, the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, and Paranormal Stories. And don't forget my latest little book called UFOs. Couldn't figure out how to put paranormal into the title. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.